Leanne Dalzell.
Mr Speaker, that repeats the consistent message that we've heard from the government with respect to our concern about this being a piecemeal approach. And I think the Minister said that it was one in a series of measures and it wasn't piecemeal because it's one piece or one building block. And he then suggested that I had raised a concern about needing to have all the blocks together, but he's now reneged on that and understands that it was the Honourable Annette King who said it. And Annette King said it for a very good reason, and that is that it's true that the foundation needs to be built first, but actually the foundation does need to be built first in the legislative sense as well. And this is not the full framework of the legislation, and it's not the foundation, it's a component of the framework. And without a foundation to secure it to, then I believe that many of the risks that currently exist in our regulatory framework will continue to exist. And when I spoke during the committee stages, I made the point on more than one occasion, and I want to repeat it here and now because I heard the Minister chipping our spokesperson in this area, Raymond Hall, with his comments about the 1991 legislation and making the point that it was a Labor government that introduced that bill. And yes, it was. And the point that I'm making and have continued to make throughout this debate is that the fact that both of us were culpable in terms of the deregulation of the building industry doesn't make it right. And the fact that we introduced legislation and National saw it through into its legislative form doesn't make either one of us any better than the other. In fact, it exposes the risk that we have when we pass legislation without recognising what the impact will be. And this is more than an unintended consequence. I mean, we've all brought bills back to the House shortly after something's been enacted and the Supreme Court or the Court of Appeal have told us that it means something different from what we intended. We've all had to bring legislation to the House to resolve interpretive matters where there have been unintended consequences. This isn't an unintended consequence. It's a consequence that arose directly because of a number of decisions that all combined, and the legislative framework was just one element of it. And I heard the previous comments from the member who's just resumed her seat talking about the need to deregulate and get rid of red tape and reduce compliance costs. That's all very well and good to be speaking about those things when there are no risks, but where there are significant risks. And I don't believe that we are just talking about health and safety when we talk about risks, because I know people, obviously people in this House know constituents who face financial ruin because of the leaky building syndrome, and I hate calling it a syndrome as well, because it's actually a failure of the regulatory framework in order to provide protections that ought to have been there. And this is why I've been making this plea on behalf of the people that I've certainly been privileged to represent for a number of years, and that is to make sure that we get this right. And that's why I really think that this legislation should have been delayed until we had all of the foundation prepared. And I don't believe that the foundation is secure at the moment. And I was the Minister, as I said in the House yesterday, I was the Minister that was responsible for the discussion document going out, which ultimately led to the introduction and passage of the 2004 Building Act. But I also made the point that I was the Minister who was the Minister in charge in this area when John Scarry wrote his open letter to IPENS. He actually wrote his letter to IPENS at the request or suggestion of the Vice President of IPENS at the time, after he'd disclosed to him the level of concern that he had around a number of buildings with respect to both Auckland and Wellington, I think, were his primary focus of concern at the time. And rather than raise it as a complaint to IPENS, the suggestion was that it come in the form of a letter. He wanted to write it as an article for the IPENS magazine, and they said, no, write us a letter. Well, the letter became quite a substantial document in its own right, some 100 or something pages long. I have a copy of it here. It is a major, major document. And this is the thing that I think my colleague Raymond Hall has been trying to make in this House, and that is that when this individual made his stand, as it were, in order to bring the politicians' attention, the professionals' attention to the parlour state of some practices within structural engineering in this country, he was doing so knowing that there were some risks around speaking out, and actually some of the risks have been met in the sense that there is a sense that people who speak out in this area are at risk of being denigrated, publicly put down, and then told that actually they don't have the backing of the profession, and that is, an organisation like IPENS, has 10,000 members, and obviously not one of them agrees with him. Well, that's simply unfair, and I think that it's a concern when I have a copy of the report that was done for IPENS and also the report that was done for the Building Industry Authority in those days, both of which acknowledged that he had major and very real concerns about the state of some of the buildings. Now, he wouldn't tell me at the time which buildings he was particularly concerned about, but because I know what I know, I actually know what some of those buildings are. And it is very difficult to have that knowledge and know that Wellington, being the seismic risk that it is, knowing that if something happens, then you would obviously be carrying that weight if the consequences were as severe as they might well be. And I guess that's what I took with me when I received this open letter. I couldn't sleep because it was essentially a warning, and once it was in the hands of a decision maker, there was an obligation to do something. And so we did do something. We referred it on for the advice, and the advice indicated to us that the changes that we were to implement as the Building Act 2004 would address the concerns that had been raised. And I was comforted by that. We were going down the right track to correct the problem. The problem had been correctly identified. The solution was there, waiting for introduction. Now, but now, having spoken to John Scarry since and having heard him in the media of recent times, I hear that the Building Act 2004 did not address all of the concerns that he raised. And that's what worries me. He was right when he wrote in 2002 warning of these issues. And what I'm worried about, Minister, is that he might be right again. I don't know, because I'm not a technical expert in this area, and that is why his work needs to be referred to an independent analysis so that it can be checked for the concerns that have been raised. And as I said in the House over the last couple of days as well, I have spoken to other engineers who totally agree and support his concerns, and they too want to have these matters opened up. And I think that we owe it not just to Mr. Scarry, whose reputation has been tarnished yet again, but we actually owe it to the people who live and work in those buildings to know that we are taking those claims seriously. And I believe that proceeding with changes to our building regulation without getting it right first time is just as bad as building the building and not getting it right first time.
I call the honourable member